Winston Churchill is often celebrated for his leadership of Britain during World War II for rallying the nation against National Socialist Germany. Yet, his record includes a series of highly harmful actions. During the 1943 Bengal famine, Churchill prioritized European war needs over Indian relief, resulting in millions of deaths, and blaming the famine on Indians breeding like rabbits. As Home Secretary, he supported the forced sterilization of the feeble-minded, how he called them, and sent troops to suppress peaceful strikers during the Tony Pandy riots in 1910. In Ireland in 1920, he deployed the Black and Tans, a force notorious for excessive violence against Irish civilians and the Irish Republican Army. Then he was responsible for the horrific 1945 firebombing of Dresden, which killed tens of thousands of civilians without clear military purpose. He also expressed hierarchical and racist views, seeing white Protestant Christians at the top of a racial hierarchy and disparaging Indians and the Indian National Congress, while actively opposing native self-rule in Africa, America, Australia, and India. He defended British imperialism as altruistic, claiming colonial rule elevated subject peoples. Churchill also advocated the use of chemical weapons against what he called uncivilized tribes, targeting Kurds and Afghans. Thomas Jefferson is remembered as a founding father and the main author of the Declaration of Independence, a huge advocate of freedom and equality. In stark contradiction to those principles, Jefferson enslaved more than 600 people over his lifetime. Among them was Sally Hemings, an enslaved girl of about 14 with whom Jefferson fathered at least 6 children. Hemings herself was the mixed-race half-sister of Jefferson's late wife. Jefferson never publicly acknowledged his children with Hemings, though some later lived as white to escape slavery. While living in Paris, where slavery was not legal, Hemings negotiated with Jefferson to return to the Monticello residence only if her children would eventually be freed. Jefferson did arrange freedom for her surviving children, mostly after his death, but never freed Hemings herself or the enslaved families at Monticello. Jefferson also advocated for deporting freed black people to Africa, claiming they couldn't coexist with whites. Mahatma Gandhi is remembered as India's national hero, the figure who led the freedom movement through non-violent resistance, and whose followers called him Mahatma, meaning great soul. But behind his global image lies heavy controversy. During his 2 decades in South Africa, starting in 1893, Gandhi rose to prominence by campaigning for better treatment of Indians, but at the cost of openly demeaning black Africans. He argued that white people should remain the predominating race and believed Indians were superior. He called for segregation, including separate entrances for Indians and Africans. He emphasized a shared Indo-Aryan heritage between Indians and the English, distancing Indians from black South Africans. He even used the racial slur Kafir when referring to Africans. Gandhi also defended the caste system in India, seeing it as a divine social order. While he opposed extreme exclusion, he believed the unity of Hindu society was more important than full equality for untouchables, the lowest caste forced into degrading jobs such as cleaning human waste. Gandhi also saw menstruation as a sign of impurity, argued intercourse should exist only for procreation, and placed the burden on women to control men's desires. He imposed strict codes on his female followers, including cutting off a girl's hair to stop harassment from men. Gandhi also carried out weird experiments to test his chastity, including sleeping naked with his teenage grandniece and several other women to prove his self-control. Albert Einstein is celebrated as a great scientist for his theories of relativity, which transformed our understanding of space-time and gravity. His personal life, however, was marked by problematic behavior. He was unfaithful to his first wife, Mileva Maric, with whom he had 2 sons and an illegitimate daughter, whose existence was hidden. Her fate remains unclear. Later, he married his cousin and former mistress Elsa Löwenthal. Einstein continued extramarital affairs after this marriage and treated Mileva harshly, reducing her role to that of a servant. Letters and diaries also reveal his sexist views, seeing women as passive and dominated. Einstein's private diaries reveal xenophobic attitudes, describing Chinese and Japanese people as filthy and obtuse. Politically, he supported socialism, which led the US government to monitor him as a potential subversive. He also supported the Manhattan Project's development, but later regretted its use. Thomas Edison is celebrated for innovations like the light bulb, phonograph, and early motion pictures. In reality, many of his creations were improvements on existing designs, and his true talent lay in marketing and securing patents rather than inventing from scratch. Edison often took credit for the work of others, including Joseph Swan, who was independently developing the light bulb. He also treated employees harshly. Nikola Tesla, for example, was promised $50,000 for fixing Edison's machines, but was later told it was a joke. Edison's business practices were ruthless. During the War of the Currents, he actively campaigned against alternating current, AC, spreading misinformation and publicly electrocuting animals to portray AC as dangerous to maintain his market advantage. Edison also exploited the patent system to dominate industries, filing over 1,000 patents and suing competitors, like early filmmakers. This cutthroat tactic secured his market power but stifled innovation. Theodor Seuss Geisel, aka Dr. Seuss, is celebrated as one of the most influential children's authors, including classics like The Cat in the Hat and How the Grinch Stole Christmas, selling more than 600 million copies worldwide. However, several of his early books contained racist imagery and stereotypes of Black, Asian, and Arab people, leading Dr. Seuss Enterprises to cease their publication in 2021. Characters of color were often dehumanized or depicted in subservient roles. Before his children's books, Geisel created political cartoons from the 1920s through the 40s that were blatantly racist, depicting black people as savages, Arabs as exoticized nomads, and Japanese Americans in demeaning ways, even supporting their internment during World War II. His personal life was also controversial. While his first wife, Helen, suffered from severe illness, he had an affair, later marrying his mistress less than a year after Helen's death. Hans Asperger, an Austrian pediatrician, is known for his studies of atypical neurology in children and the namesake of the autism spectrum disorder, Asperger syndrome. He gained international recognition posthumously in the 1980s, but Asperger's legacy is marred by his involvement with the Nazi regime. During World War II, he referred children to the Am Spiegelgrund Clinic in Vienna, where many disabled children lost their lives and were experimented on. He described some children as burdens or uneducable. He openly supported Nazi race hygiene policies, including forced sterilizations, and joined affiliated organizations, though he was not a formal party member. While he promoted curative education within his field, there is no evidence he resisted Nazi policies. Most say he was a well-adapted cogwheel in the Nazi system, but some say he didn't have a choice. Mother Teresa, born Agnes Gonja Boyadju, is celebrated worldwide for her work with poor people. She received many civilian awards, including the Nobel Peace Prize in 1979 and later the Order of Merit from Queen Elizabeth II. She was even canonized as a saint by Pope Francis in 2016. Her reputation, however, is highly controversial. Reports from her missionaries of charity homes often describe poor hygiene, reuse of dirty needles, neglect in pain management, and minimal medical oversight. Critics argue she prioritized spiritual care over the physical well-being of patients, since she often glorified suffering, calling it beautiful and a way to connect with Jesus. Questions have also been raised about the organization's finances. While it collected tens of millions in donations, there was little transparency, and funds often went toward religious activities rather than directly improving care. Her fundraising and friendships also drew criticism, including associations with corrupt figures like Haiti's Jean-Claude Duvalier, accused of torture and murder, and American financier Charles Keating, who stole from taxpayers. Some say she was naive or opportunistic and didn't know their crimes. Further unverified allegations include nuns secretly baptizing dying patients without consent and claims that infants were sold in facilities run by her order in India, though these reports remain disputed. John Lennon is known as a founder and leader of the Beatles, one of the most influential bands of all time. However, his personal life was marked by violence and hypocrisy. Lennon admitted to being physically and verbally abusive toward his first wife, Cynthia Powell, and neglected his son Julian after their divorce. Despite openly preaching peace in the late 60s and early 70s, he engaged in drunken brawls and violent outbursts, including throwing a glass that hit a waitress in a Los Angeles club and having an affair with Yoko Ono's assistant during his period of excessive drinking and substance use. Lennon also famously claimed that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus in a 1966 interview. The comment was seen as blasphemous and disrespectful to many religious groups at the time and provoked protests, boycotts, and threats against the band. He also endorsed radical causes like the Black Panthers while living a lavish lifestyle. Joseph Kennedy Sr., best known as the father of John F. Kennedy and for serving as ambassador to the United Kingdom, carried a legacy marked by influence and controversy. His most infamous decision involved his daughter Rosemary Kennedy. Born seemingly healthy, Rosemary developed more slowly than her siblings, and by her 20s she showed signs of mood swings and developmental challenges. At age 23, Joseph arranged her to undergo a prefrontal lobotomy, a new and experimental surgery intended to reduce behavioral issues. The procedure, performed without Rosemary's consent and without informing her mother, went disastrously wrong. She was left unable to walk or speak coherently and was reduced to the mental capacity of a toddler. Following the botched surgery, Rosemary was institutionalized for the rest of her life, hidden from public view and even from many family members. Joseph's decision was widely seen as an attempt to protect the political prospects of his sons by avoiding scandal, but it came at the cost of his daughter's health and dignity. Charlie Chaplin was an English actor celebrated as one of the greatest pioneers of cinema, creating timeless films that shaped filmmaking and comedy. But his relationships with much younger women drew controversy. At 29, he married his first wife, Mildred Harris, who was just 16. At 35, he wed Lita Gray, then 16, after she became pregnant. A marriage critic's note could have led to sexual assault charges under California law. Their relationship ended bitterly with accusations of abuse and infidelity. Chaplin later married more actresses with wide age gaps, including Paulette Goddard, 22 to his 43, and most famously Una O'Neill, who was only 18 when she married 54-year-old Chaplin. His perceived communist sympathies also fueled his negative reputation, culminating in exile from the US. Alfred Nobel, the Swedish chemist, is celebrated for leaving most of his fortune to create the Nobel Prizes, which since 1901 have honored breakthroughs in science, literature, and peace. But Nobel built his fortune as a merchant of death. Born into a poor family that supplied explosives to the Russian Tsar, Nobel turned to nitroglycerin experiments after his father's business collapsed. In 1867, he invented dynamite, a stable explosive meant for mining and construction, yet it quickly became a tool of destruction, used in the Franco-Prussian War. Nobel's wealth grew further through his ownership of Bofors, a company that profited massively from selling cannons and munitions to militaries across Europe. In 1888, a newspaper wrongly published a death notice for Alfred Nobel after his brother Ludwig died, calling him the man who got rich by inventing ways to kill people faster. This label haunted Nobel and likely spurred his decision to fund the prizes, a move to rewrite his legacy. Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp, is hailed as the founder of modern nursing. Her sanitation reforms during the Crimean War saved countless lives. Yet her legacy is also tied to exclusion and racial bias. All of the nurses she recruited for Crimea were white women, and her writings often aligned with the ideology of British colonialism, reinforcing the idea that nursing was a role reserved for white women. This bias was most evident in her treatment of Mary Seacole, a Jamaican-born nurse of mixed race who offered her services but was rejected from Nightingale's group due to her duskier skin, but also her informal training. Dubbed the Black Nightingale, Seacole was sidelined in her time. Nightingale's later work in India further showed her colonial lens, dismissing indigenous medical practices as inferior. Pablo Picasso was a Spanish painter regarded as one of the most influential artists in the 20th century, celebrated for pioneering Cubism. But behind his artistic genius, Picasso was notorious for his misogyny. His relationships with women, often much younger, were marked by emotional manipulation and cruelty. He openly declared that there are only two kinds of women: goddesses and doormats, reflected in how he treated many of his partners. In his art, women were often reduced to objects or distorted forms. Two of his partners suffered mental breakdowns linked to his treatment. Picasso also exploited African and Iberian art for his own gain. His painting Les Demoiselles d'Avignon used African masks and Iberian designs to create his Cubist style, but these artifacts, often looted during colonial raids, carried deep cultural meaning Picasso ignored, treating them as exotic props. Politically, Picasso was opportunistic, joining the Communist Party in 1944 for clout while ignoring Stalin's atrocities, despite painting anti-war works like Guernica. Sigmund Freud, the Austrian neurologist and founder of psychoanalysis, reshaped how people understood the mind and human behavior, though his legacy remains deeply controversial. Early in his career, Freud developed the seduction theory, linking women's hysteria to childhood trauma, which today would be recognized as PTSD. But he later abandoned the idea, in part to protect reputations in Vienna's elite, destroyed his evidence and discouraged colleagues from pursuing it. His theories often reflected sexist and androcentric biases, such as his ideas of women being morally inferior, incomplete, and destined to fulfill men's needs as wives or mothers. Freud also heavily used a certain white substance, promoted it as a cure-all, and even prescribed it to treat addiction, which led to disaster. In one notorious case, he recommended nasal surgery for his patient Emma Eckstein, a procedure that he didn't know, and nearly killed her due to surgical negligence. Yet he concealed responsibility. His relationship with his wife Martha was highly controlling, isolating her from her family and interests. Over time, much of Freud's work has been discredited, with scientists rejecting his sexualized model of development as unscientific.